the show that I tried to get out of doing and was talked out of it and into doing it, even though it's a day late, so we apologize. Not because I don't want to talk about this person, but because I don't want to talk about it in this context. And to join me in doing this, my co-host, the great Brian Last, who is the aforesaid individual who talked me into doing this program.
Aloha, Jim. Pleasure to be here once again. I know it's not the easiest week to do a show, considering the circumstances, but I think a lot of people will be happy to hear from you today.
Well, and that's... I'm going to be honest. What I did was I called you, a couple days ago. I said, all right. I said, can we run a rerun? No. And I thought you were going to hit me with the sponsor commitments, which we do have, because I had already planned to say, well, we can do makeups next week. Everybody's entitled to a week off every now and then. But then you hit me with the listeners and the people are going to want to hear what you have to say, which made me feel rotten. So, folks, if you don't know what we're talking about by now, but I would imagine you do because it got so much publicity, and we'll talk about why and et cetera. But Tracy Smothers passed away a couple days ago. We had known since late last year that he was sick. He'd had cancer. He got treatments. I saw him last December at the event that they held in Knoxville for Bobby Eaton. That is, a matter of fact, that's the last public appearance I've made. And he had been at WrestleCade in Winston-Salem about a couple weeks before that, and people saw that he was not looking well, and that's when he came out and told everybody. But he had the issues with cancer at that point, and it had treatments, and that had, it gotten better at some point, but it had returned. And also, besides the fact that Tracy's body had just been beaten up over the years ridiculously in wrestling, apparently he'd had a heart attack at some point and did not know it. And they found damage later on, so he only had like half of his heart function, and had also in addition to undergoing the cancer treatments again, had a hernia somehow, and they were trying to figure out how to do surgery on that and treat that around the other stuff. And so anyway, I didn't know it had gotten this bad this quick again until I think about a week or so ago. And we had Brian, you and I had talked about it. There was a GoFundMe that had been set up, and we just heard about it, and we're checking to make sure everything was good. And we're going to mention that, and did not have the opportunity. I would assume Tracy didn't have insurance, or obviously not being able to work, even if he had any kind of insurance. I don't want to speak improperly, but here's the thing is, I'm going to be all over the page because as Brian knows, I have not prepared anything to talk about, because that would have required thinking about this whole thing. And it's a little much these days with this happening so often, but I don't usually plug GoFundMes, not only because, if you do it, everybody in the world says, oh, my friend or my child or whatever, then you would just be plugging nothing but GoFundMes in our position. But in the wrestling industry, a lot of times you don't know. And I think one of the girls one time ran a GoFundMe for somebody said for cosmetic surgery, but or it's somebody that's made big money and honestly blown it, or whatever the case. But in this case, Tracy, unfortunately, he made good money and money in wrestling for a long period of time, but he never made big money. And it wasn't because of a shortcoming on his part, but because of the way the business changed right when he got in it. which we'll talk about. So anyway, I think, and later on, and Brian, I know you were going to look it up, but I think that fund has been turned into something for, funeral expenses or whatever, and you can bring that up here in a little while. But the thing about Tracy is he came along, he was the perfect guy that came along at the wrong time. And even though he had reinvented himself over the last, longer probably than his run in the territories and in the big leagues, as they say, as a heel, and because he was fucking entertaining and as a person, and he just went with it because that was, wrestling's what he did. And to stay in it, he did those things, but he was the quintessential hometown babyface. And hometown, you say, and one town, well, it could have been any town. Here's the concept in wrestling is as old as it's older than pro wrestling. It's as old as wrestling. The concept in anything of a hometown hero or a local boy made good, or he's one of us. That's what, in large part, pro wrestling operated on for the first 100 years it was around. Whether it was the local college football star or the local boy, but it's not just wrestling, politics, any kind of sports, anything. One of us made good. And Brian, think of how many territories, and even before the days of the formation of the territories, just big gates and crowds in the wrestling industry revolved around some way or another manipulating a local guy or a transplanted local that he may have been born in Oklahoma, but folks, he played football here in Florida or whatever, has made good in wrestling. Gus Sonnenberg, in the fucking 20s. And Tracy was perfect for, the one thing I did start thinking about was if Tracy had come along exactly as he was in Smoky Mountain Wrestling 20 years earlier, or if the territories had gone on existing in the ways that they did 20 years later, Tracy Smothers as a main event level babyface with his level of work and his hard work in the ring, nobody ever worked any harder anywhere at anything practically than Tracy Smothers, and his promo and his size, the whole 9 yards, it just because he was from Tennessee, the wild-eyed Southern boy, he could have been figured in the Florida territory, in the Georgia territory, in the Carolinas. He could have hung with those guys. It would have worked in Texas, definitely Mid-South wrestling, as well as the Memphis territory and Smoky Mountain wrestling. Those kind of baby faces, you always had your flamboyant, over-the-top, crazy gimmick baby faces. Mad Dog Vachon was a baby face at points in his career, especially when he became a legend. Handsome Jimmy Valiant was crazy. But the guy that territories like that wanted to build on as their white meat baby face, the hero to the girls, the guys that looked up to him, the Magnum TAs, the Barry Windhams, the whatever the fuck. You wanted them to be believable in the territories. You wanted them to be Eddie Marlin, for fuck's sake, in Tennessee. We talked about him when he passed away last year and how he got over as a main event guy in his 40s in the territory and drew huge houses because he was one of the people that were going to buy a ticket to see him. That was a bonus for a baby face in those days, in the Southern territories especially. You wanted people to identify with this guy. You wanted people to believe that he was really who he was supposed to be and that he meant the things that he was saying. And he worked like that. And the idea of that kind of babyface is not that he was doing all the crazy, wild moves, but that he was going to take an ass kicking, bleed and fight and be screwed around and put upon and cheated out of shit, but never stop and finally win the thing, whatever the thing was. And for that, it required the business where people believed, or at least would believe if you gave them something that didn't slap them in the face with it, because they wanted to believe. And when they got behind those guys, then that they not only got over, but they stayed over in especially in these territories that were weekly territories or bi-weekly, and they saw them so many times and they rose and fell with them. And Tracy was really one of the last gasps of that. He was perfect for that in Smoky Mountain. And we talked about when we've done some of the deep dives. And if I don't tell all the stories today, go to YouTube, because I'm sure there's some on there. When we've done the deep dives on Smoky Mountain Wrestling, the Bluegrass Brawl, the Night of the Legends, whatever. Tracy was he was the perfect guy that I lucked into to fill that spot that hadn't been seen as a single on a national level and been, beat to death, that connected with the people, that filled that spot that almost nobody else could. Originally, I wanted Brad Armstrong. And finally, I got Brad late in the Smoky Mountain run, but I think it was better that way because Tracy was newer and fresher. Even though Brad had been over in that territory before, like we talked about, Tracy, they knew him, but he'd never been featured to that extent in Continental. But he made the thing because he worked his ass off. So I think that's when you look at all the places that would have used a guy like Tracy, that you would have used Tracy, period, in all those different territories, had he not been unfortunately born too late and didn't get into business till, somebody said 83, and I think he may have done a couple of outlaw shows in 83, but it was 85 in Tennessee when he got a chance to, he trained some with Tojo. Stan and Steve took him under their wing early, and Stan had known him. And, he got a chance to work Memphis, and I think they went to Florida, and then territories are gone. And then by the time that they got pigeonholed as the tag team, the Southern Boys were a fabulous tag team, but then they had to be the Young Pistols because there was more people in Wyoming than there was in fucking the South. I don't know. And they just got flip-flopped around on the national TV. He really didn't get a chance to do what he was capable of until he got the run in Smoky Mountain. I've rambled on. Where am I going with this?
That's one of my favorite things, actually, about his arrival in Smoky Mountain. You did this really good interview with him, because it wasn't polished. It just seemed natural. It seemed real, where he was like on the porch of his house, explaining about his Young Pistols run. I have nothing against Cheyenne, Wyoming, but I've never been there.
Yeah.
I don't know anything about it. I'm actually just a Southern boy.
Well, that's what I told him. I said, just sit down, and without saying that the wrestling business is fake, just say to him, you're tired of other people telling you who to be and telling people who you are, and that's not who you are, and it's obvious to everybody. And that's why you're here, because you've come home to prove what you can do. And that's what we got. And everybody can identify with that, right? And then we took him out and had him drive the boat around. We borrowed a boat from somebody and just walking around in the woods and shit country people do, right? For fuck's sake, because he's from Springfield, Tennessee. And we used the Skinnerd song. All I Can Do Is Write About It, right? And it was a chance for him to be him, and also, obviously, self-serving on my part. I needed a top babyface that people would be interested in. But, so you can let him, do that all you want on TV, but then he has to get in the ring and get it over. And he had a very unorthodox style, but it worked for Tracy, and it was so different that it made him stand out. And when he was fighting, you felt like he was fighting because he was in fucking motion and he had fire. And when he sold, he was down on his hands and knees and crawling around and fucking shaking his head, and you felt like he's fucked up. And even though he was 6'2", 6'3", and 235 in those days, he could do the fucking flying elbow jaw jacker off the top as his finish, and come off with the double axe handle or whatever, and drop kick and shit, and do the flying kicks. But he wasn't out there doing goddamn gymnastics routines. It was in part of his offense when he was beating up a bigger guy. But yeah, that with the video, and that's just how we, presented him. And he got his Southern boy stuff out of the fucking closet, and he was the wild-eyed Southern boy. Because the Southern boys, him and Steve, I'd been keeping an eye on him anyway. Because obviously, if they had gotten loose from their contract, I wanted them. And as a tag team, because that's how I saw him originally, right? And that was the point where Steve got the brief run in New York. As soon as they got out of their WCW contracts, Steve had got the call, and I don't know how that got hooked up, but he was going to be a singing cowboy, right?
Lance Cassidy.
Yes. God damn it. But anyway, and he went, and he had to go and try, right? Because that was a lot more money he was going to make, working Smoky Mountain Wrestling. But that's when I guess he was up there for a few months or whatever it was, and the Armstrongs didn't like to be away from home for a long period of time. And this was one of those deals where they were on the road for like fucking 2 or 3 weeks straight. And Steve's told me himself later on, he said, I got up in a hotel room somewhere and looked in the mirror, and the mirror cracked. And he fucking called the office, said I quit, and flew back home. But I'd already started Tracy, so that's why I brought Steve in with Scott. Anyway, so at that was the point where, and I've said this before, Brian Lee was not a great top babyface. He was much better heel, but he's who I'd started with because that's who was available. And when it came time, I was able to transition Brian over to being a heel, where he excelled better by being able to bring Tracy in as a single. And that's why I said, all right, I've got one Southern boy, but Tracy's a great baby face. And now that the Southern boy team is going to be broken up, well, then we will do this. And that's how that happened. And like I said, with the video and on the porch and the whole 9 yards, and and just the music made it wasn't like some goddamn, revolutionary fucking music video or whatever. It just gave you the flavor of Tracy.
You talk about the Southern Boys, and I know we did the watch along just recently with the Midnight Express and the Southern Boys at Great American Bash 90. And in a lot of ways, that's the match that put them on the map nationally. That's the match that, in a lot of ways, legitimized them to the smart fans, let's say. Because that ended up finishing, I think, third in the Match of the Year rankings in the Observer, and it wasn't. By the way, the first 2 matches were in Japan, so
yeah,
it was the top ranked American match, and that was a year with a lot of big matches, but none excited people the way that match did. And to me, that's one of the sad things: is just the program that could have been with the Southern Boys and the Midnight Express.
Well, but here's the thing. That was the first ever grudge match in wrestling where the guys had a grudge against the Office. And, and especially when we did the watch along, and y'all can find that out there also. But when we did the watch along, I explained that, they wanted Ole decided, okay, for the only time that year, I think the Midnight Express, the second time in a year, the Midnight Express is going to actually win a pay-per-view match, but he didn't want any manager interference or use the racket or whatever. So we knew that we needed to gear it up a notch in the actual match. Those guys were great to work with. Like I said, the Stan and Tracy with the karate spot, because they had worked with each other, and Stan helped train him in Tennessee. And, Steve was such a great flyer and all the stuff Bobby could do. And then we false finished them to death. We either had, was it 4 or 5 false finishes? in that match, which for a tag team match was off the charts back then, because you didn't, I don't want to get off on a tangent into wrestling psychology, but if you go back and watch the classic tag matches, you didn't have a million false finishes, because even though you had a lot of false finishes in a world title match with Flair and Steamboat, whatever, the backslides, small packages, near falls, whatever, it's harder to change the momentum and go back and forth in a tag team match, because you're turning two guys' momentum or four guys instead of two. So that's why sometimes if tag matches go into too many false finishes back and forth, you lose the plot. But in this case, one fed into the other, and that's what had the people on the edge of their seats. So the finish, even the heels won. Holy shit, it's Baltimore, it's up north, they like the heels anyway. But the Southern boys got over with them because it was a great fucking match, and they got some respect from the people. But that's because they were using neither, they weren't really using either team, and they had something to prove, and they, we all decided to buckle in and see if we could come up with something. And that's the thing. Tracy always Tracy worked too hard to where I actually, a couple of times on Smoky Mountain spot shows, if I knew he was sore or had a tough match in Knoxville or the day after one of those chain matches or whatever, I was at Tracy, you can just ease up. Oh, I want to blah, blah, blah. Or if somebody wasn't there, I can work twice. And you, as far as being a dedicated employee or somebody that want to make sure people got their money's worth or take care of the wrestling business or just do the right thing or whatever, you wanted 20 of those people. 20 people like Tracy in the locker room, if you could.
And by the time he got to Smoky Mountain, he was still fairly young, and he had already worked for Memphis. He had a run in the UWF. I mean, he was an undercard guy doing jobs on TV, but he had worked for Watts. He had worked in Continental. He had worked in WCW. I mean, even
Florida.
Florida. Even though the territories were dying out, he had worked a number of places before he even got to Smoky Mountain.
Well, yeah, that period, like I said, in '85, from Tennessee, he was able to go, the last days of the UWF, and then he and Steve as a team in Florida. Eddie Graham was already gone, and they were about to be bought by. Then they did get bought by Crockett. That's where we first worked with him in '87. We went down to do one of the Florida TV tapings, and that's where, from that point on, I knew that. Well, I didn't know in 1987 I was going to start a fucking territory, but I noticed people like that when we worked with them. And so they were always on the radar when I actually did start thinking about talent, because they were a good team then. And it's just that then, finally, by the time they got the WCW was falling apart by the time they got the chance to work there. And they also are another team that fell victim to the rotating bookers and rotating philosophies, and 3 months with this creative team, and then Dusty moved him to Wyoming, and then Dusty, he did that as a rib, because not as a rib on them, but when they went and told, they actually said the Southern boys they didn't want the Southern boys on WCW because WCW had the reputation as Southern wrestling. That was the only thing keeping people watching them at that point, was they had the reputation of Southern wrestling. And I think Dusty knew it was ridiculous. He said, well, let's make them cowboys, because Dusty liked cowboys, because it was fucking stupid. Anyway, I digress. Where was I? I don't even know where I was.
Well, one thing, I've never talked to you about is while he was working for Smoky Mountain, he did several Japanese tours. And he did a lot of the garbage stuff. Like I remember Tracy sending me a tape. He goes, here's me in Japan. And I didn't realize it was him. It was him as Jason the Terrible for Wing.
Yeah.
But he also wrestled for All Japan, which is obviously a very physical style. What do you remember about while he was in the midst of being the top babyface for Smoky Mountain Wrestling, him going to Japan?
Well, see, that's, I actually read that somewhere. I'm trying to remember. Somebody asked on Twitter or whatever. I've tried to stay off mostly the internet the past couple of days, but There was never any issue because I think he had a trip or two for Baba. I remember him going over and doing the independent stuff. What was that, FMW at the time?
It was Wing, which
was another. Yeah,
it was like worse than FMW. It was FMW if FMW didn't have standards.
Well, yeah, yeah. There you go. The point is that was like those trips were like I think a week or whatever. If he timed it out. I never remember Tracy missing Knoxville or Johnson City or whatever. I worked with Candido on some dates too, and worked with some of the other guys on some dates. It just depended on, but they always had them in advance in those days. But it wasn't like he was going back and forth constantly, the disrupted programs. Especially the independent thing he did over there, I think that they'd go over for like a week or whatever. So I just leave him off of Hayside, Virginia spot shows at the end of the month. It wouldn't be the big show. So that was never an issue. Not that I ever remember. I never remember having an issue with it. How about that?
What about him coming back from working that style for 2 weeks in All Japan, let's say?
Well, no, because he wasn't. We used to have to fucking get to Bobby and Jackie Fulton to calm the fuck down. Because when they'd come back, because they were going over there for Baba, and they'd go over for a month. And for All Japan, and they'd be used to fighting for their lives, and they'd come back, and Tom Pritchard and Stan Lane at the time when we first started, and Tom and Stan were partners, but said, Jesus Christ, they just got back from Japan, and we're going to get beat up for a week. But Tracy could slip right. He knew the difference. Tracy could throw some live rounds just because he was so physical and so into it. But it wasn't like there was a noticeable difference where you had to remind him to work like Tracy.
When you bring up Tom Pritchard, I got to see a lot of Smoky Mountain Wrestling shows live. I got to see him in front of the biggest houses you ever drew, and of course in front of some small spot shows. And I saw every TV show. I've seen so many of the house shows, either camcorder footage or stuff you released. Those are the two guys, Tom Pritchard and Tracy Smothers. When I think of Smoky Mountain Wrestling, there was no one who worked harder every single day. There was never a bad match. There was never like, oh, these guys are phoning it in. Tracy Smothers and Tom Pritchard, to me, whenever I think of Smoky Mountain Wrestling, those are the first two in-ring workers I think of.
Yeah, and that's why, as a matter of fact, they had the grapple in the gravel, as Tom called it. Oh, God. They used to come over, the guys that lived when we first started. And actually, some of the guys never moved from Nashville. And Tracy had a house in Springfield, so he lived there. But they would, it's the other end of the state. They'd come over for the weekend shows, right? And Tom eventually moved over there. And Tony Anthony had been living in Nashville when he was working Memphis, but he was from Knoxville. But anyway, some of the guys would ride back and forth. And I guess Tom had been winding Tracy up one day about whatever. And Tracy, the one thing, bless him, about Tracy is even back then, he used to joke in Smoky Mountain about having probably 10 or 12 concussions. And, and back then, we're laughing too, and now it explains some things about various people, but we didn't know what we knew then, but we did know that Tracy would sometimes get ticked off and go from 0 to 60 instantly. So somewhere or another, Tom had been ribbing Tracy. And then, of course, in the buildings most of the time, I think we were up in Eastern Kentucky, the locker rooms are separate. So they may have, ridden over to the Knoxville Inn together, but they're not just together constantly. So now I guess Ricky Morton took the opportunity to wind Tracy up about what Tom had said. And by the time they got in the ring for the Battle Royal that night, Tracy went for Tom. And what the fuck you got, blah, blah, blah. And there's cousin and there's what. And people are trying to get in between them. And so cooler heads prevailed. But Tracy's like, I'll see you later. And then they actually pulled over on the side of the road because now Doc's fired up. Like, what the fuck? What the fuck's with this guy? And all was great the next day. They settled everything the next day. That's why I'm telling this story. It's not like there's been any lingering heat because now it's one of those funny stories. But they're coming back from the town. Whoever Tom's riding the car with now, is fucking going down the road, and there's fucking Tracy, and Tom says, pull over, and Tom pulls over, and Tracy's car pulls over, and they get out and they lock up. And that's when Tom realized, because there was a little promo first, but then when they locked up, Tom realized, well, shit, he doesn't really want to fight, neither do I, because they locked up. Actual collar and elbow on the side of the road in the gravel in the middle of eastern Kentucky. And right as they're doing this, and they're bulling back around a little bit, and they're thinking better of it, because it's the boys, right? But right then, a fucking blue light pulls in behind them. It's the fucking cops. And here's these two guys, and the people that are riding in the car with them. So there's probably like 6 guys pulled over on the side of the road. 2 of them are scuffling in the gravel. There's obviously beer is contained in both of these cars in some fashion. And the cop's like, what the fuck? And Tracy says, I got this. He says, officer, we wrestled up the road in Cumberland with his accent, right? Because then automatically, he know, okay, the cop knows at least this is fucking local people here. We wrestled up the road. We're just trying out some moves. And the cops, don't do it in my fucking town. Get the fuck out of here, and let them go. And they all drove down the road. And then Doc calls me at night. Well, me and Tracy just had a fight in the gravel. What? And we did interviews or whatever the next day, and they came early and talked about it. But
you brought up before how Tracy could have been, in the Territory days, a babyface anywhere he went. But I think the big revelation was in 95 when I started seeing the videos. And then, of course, I was in Louisville when the fans started a riot and trying to get at us, the fans, that Tracy was a fantastic heel.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of people talk about it, in ECW, he started doing that dance. He started doing that in USWA as a heel because we were popping for, like, what is he doing? He would just start doing it. I don't know how to explain it. He would put his arms out and just shake his hips.
He was humping the people. That's what he was doing. He was like, fuck you, without actually saying fuck you when you couldn't say fuck you back then. He was humping people. It was just an open-armed hump.
But it was great. Right? He did great promos. I was so surprised because you think of him as being the epitome of a babyface. But he was fantastic as a heel. I wish he would have done more of that. I wish he would have had more opportunities. I wish there were territories he could have, but great heel when he had a chance.
Well, and see, that's the thing is I've went on, as you mentioned, about how great a babyface he was. And that's something that I couldn't, if I'd have turned him in Knoxville and he'd have done the same stuff, I think it would have got the wrong kind of heat because he was so good at making them like him and them kind of believing it that it would have been one of those, we don't want to see that kind of heel turns. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong, but the reason why it was perfect at the other, because when the USWA versus Smoky Mountain thing on the other end of the state took off in Memphis, he was an outsider. He was from the other group that was trying to say that the USWA and its fans were all, he wasn't trying to say it, he was saying it. We're all shit. And they were better and blah, blah, blah. And then it fucking worked because then he's the asshole redneck that everybody knows lives down the street and fucking hates. And a big mouth asshole. But yeah, it was, and see, that was the thing when the fucking police escort had to get and our Fan Week fans from Smoky Mountain out of the Louisville Gardens. People said, why didn't the Smoky Mountain USWA angle work better or get more attention? I didn't go with it fully in the Knoxville end or whatever. To be honest, besides the fact that we were monthly and Randy Hales and the Memphis territory, they had the luxury, it may not have felt like a luxury at the time, but they had the luxury of running weekly. And they could build things, and they still had the deals with the buildings that, were beneficial to them. And they still had that Memphis TV, and Louisville TV was pretty strong too. So the problem was the talent situation was such that I had more of the guys that were over in their territory than they did at the time. Remember, except for PG-13, who I did use, because they were a fucking good little heel team. They were baby faces in Memphis. Their champion was Billy Jack. Remember Billy Jack Haynes, remember?
Yeah, he was great.
Well, but I didn't have time to. Nobody in Knoxville knew who the fuck Billy Jack Haynes was, and I didn't have time because I only had a show once a month. I couldn't program them unless I had them come in and take over my TV and then build the cards around them. And to be honest, Billy Jack didn't do it for me at that point in time. Did you really? Were you into him like crazy?
I was watching the USWA TV at that time because it was really good. It was really the last great period of USWA TV because you had Brandon Baxter, who was really good as a heel manager. You had Tracy as a heel. Brian Hildebrand, referee Mark Curtis, finally got to be a heel on Memphis TV, and he was great as the heel referee from Smoky Mountain. And Billy Jack Haynes was fantastic as a psychotic heel. Little did we know, how close to home that was.
Typecasting, possibly.
But he was great. There was so much really good stuff happening on USWA TV in 95, and so much of it was centered around the Smoky Mountain guys.
Yeah.
My favorite thing about the Team Smoky Mountain, who was on Team Smoky Mountain? Tracy Smothers, referee Mark Curtis, obviously you whenever you'd be able to make a date. You had Terry Gordy appearing with them. You had Robert Gibson as a heel.
Tommy Rich.
And then Pat Tanaka.
Well, he hopped in the car when they were buzzing through Nashville halfway to Memphis. And the bodies worked some also, especially when they came down when they got finished with their run in the WWF, they came down and would work weekends in Smoky Mountain, and then Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Memphis, Louisville, Evansville or I don't think they were running Evansville at that point, maybe West Tennessee, whatever, in Memphis. They were splitting their time. And see, that was the thing. And we'll do a deep dive into the USWA SMW feud later on. But that was the thing. And I did bring Lawler over a few times because he transitioned the Smoky Mountain title between White Boy and Bobby Blaze for me. But I guess with the Smoky Mountain USWA feud, like I said, it was a case of them being able to run the weekly towns and me only running the big towns once a month. And also I wanted to keep control because I didn't want to, get those guys too intricate in case somebody got tired of making that trip across the state. But that's where I was going with that is a lot of times people say, well, why didn't you use so-and-so or such and such or this guy or that guy in Smoky Mountain or at the time if they were in Memphis or whatever. A lot of times we knew what we were trying to do, which was run a territory. I didn't, even if I'd had the opportunity to bring name star A in, if I felt that he's going to have no vested interest in really getting this thing over because he's just biding his time until he gets another, deal with the national company or whatever, then I didn't want to get that started and just lose a guy. I wanted guys that had a home connection, that could afford to. I wasn't going to ask a guy that lived in Washington State to fucking start working 15 days a month in East Tennessee and Western Virginia for me because I wasn't going to fucking fly him every fucking week. And, so you got like in the territory days, not only was, as I said, Tracy was from Tennessee, so was Tony Anthony, the Armstrongs, lived in fucking Pensacola at the time, but they'd been driving that whole territory for years. So it was more about finding the outstanding talent that is already homesteaded here and that will come for an affordable fee, and then find new young guys like the Candidos and the Glenn Jacobses and the fucking Al Snows or whatever that will come and work for the Bruiser Bedlams. It was a guy, he came in because he wanted to see if he could make it in a territory. So that's what that was about. And for I guess when you think about it, to work 15 days a month, Tracy was making just under $2,000 guaranteed from me in Smoky Mountain. What would that be? That was in 1994. What would that be today?
Oh, I'm not sure. You're usually better with the calculations.
Well, that's because I have the keyboard in front of me and type the thing up. But so it would be more like 4-ish. because it's doubled at least. Plus, the baby faces were able to sell gimmicks, as the Rock and Roll Express will attest to. And Tracy was great with gimmicks, the Confederate flags on a stick and the pictures, and he was personable with people. But he actually, whoever he was working a program with, the heel that he was working a program with, whether it be Tony Anthony or whoever, Brian Lee sometime, he kicked them back a percentage of his gimmick sales, his merchandise. Because heels didn't sell anything. Because if you're a heel, nobody would want to buy that shit now, would they? And the heel couldn't go out in the fucking arena and sign autographs, because then not only would he not be a heel, if he was a heel worth anything, people be trying to fucking attack him. So Tracy's, well, because of the matches that we're having and this guy's helping get me over, he kicked his program opponent. I mean, not everybody every night, but he kicked his program opponents back some of his merchandise. But the point is, a guy in wrestling at that point, if he can work 15 days a month in his home area and make the equivalent, counting gimmicks, of what is today, would be $6,000 a month. How many guys in the wrestling business would take that? Let's say we'll give you $75,000 a year, work 15 times a month in the wrestling business, and you don't have to fucking fly. So that was, that was why we put together guys that knew how to do Southern wrestling, that had a vested interest in wanting to see the wrestling business and the wrestling business in that area succeed. And Tracy worked harder than anybody at it.
You bring up his gimmick table. He also would just give people gimmicks if he thought they would want it. Like it. Yeah. He used to give me stuff at Fan Week that I would take home. And I can't believe I did this looking back now. But there was a while where I would go to school on Long Island, in Long Beach, wearing a hat that said American by birth, Southern by the grace of God. Because he gave it to me and I would wear it.
And he'd give kids stuff to, here you go. What's your deal? Here you go.
What's your deal?
What's your deal? And here you go. And he'd give the kid the picture, right?
He was the first person I ever heard say that. He would always say that to me whenever we would talk on the phone. Hey, Brian, what's your deal? And it took me a while to understand how to answer that. But that's just what he says.
What's your deal? What you up to? How's it been?
You know what one of his other favorite expressions? Whenever Tracy would get angry about someone or something, and we talk about what he would do to that person, he would say, I'll knock his dick stiff.
Yeah.
Which not many people can get away with an expression like that, but he would say that often.
Well, now I'm taking up for Tracy, but I would do that all day long, but that's not a new expression, Brian. You just live up north.
That's right.
People been having their dicks knocked stiff for long before me or Tracy, either one, were born. But then the old fucking deal, right? And the guys did this when I got in the business, right? In the locker room. They would come up with the same, not exactly the same verbiage, but the same flavor. They'd say the same kind of thing. But Tracy had the best delivery. When people be going, oh, goddamn, that show is a shits. It didn't draw. The house was rotten. And people would go, well, school's just got out, or school's just gone back in, or weather just got warm, or the weather just got cold, or daylight savings time, or whatever. And it was always some fucking excuse. And then Bobby Eaton used to say, and there's an all-night gas station open down the street, right? Tracy would chime in with, well, McDonald's open. Can't compete with that. And it just... Oh, God damn it. Anyway.
The WWF run as Freddie Joe Floyd. Let's talk a little bit about that.
Well, I apologized to him a couple of times profusely. And of course, it ain't you. It ain't you. I think we've mentioned this on the show, but the idea was, at that point in 1996, the talent roster, the complete talent roster in the WWF was short and not scintillating. It was one of the smaller ones I think they've ever had. And with me and Bruce Pritchard trying to make matches for television and at the same time not give away what you were selling in the arenas, that was the thing they still try to do in those days. We got nothing. We got no combinations because there's hardly. And I had the idea, why don't we find people around the country that are not under contract to WCW? and put them under contract to us for television appearances. They can still wrestle other places they want to, but that we can bring them to TV. We give them wins to get them over, and then we use them to put our top guys over. So it's just like bringing a guy into the territory. You just don't have to book him on the house shows, because on the house shows, they were only running one show a night. I think at that point there was plenty of talent there, but we just needed more for TV. And of course, then we said, well, go find these people. So we go for good workers that you can use in a variety of situations. Bill Irwin was one. Tony Anthony and Tracy Smothers were two more. Goddamn Tom Brandy.
Alex Porteau.
Alex Porteau, the pug. Poor pug. Guys that you could easily either, they had a somewhat of a reputation, but you could easily put them over some guys, give them some TV wins, and then use them to put your stars over. And of course, they signed all those guys, immediately forgot about putting any of them over, and also immediately changed everybody's name. And we've made so much fun of this. Tony, because his father was a plumber, became T.L. Hopper. And Bill Irwin, because he played hockey one time because he was from Minnesota, became the Goon, and etc. Alex Porteau, who missed a heck of that guy was flawless as a worker and just needed to be able to develop more as a personality, but the territories went away. Because he was an amateur wrestler, he became the Pug. And it was, it had the stench of grisly death on it before it ever even fucking started. And then those people never won any matches. So it just became bad gimmicks doing jobs. But Tracy, because he was Southern, and because I guess Vince and Bruce Pritchard wasn't about to fucking disagree with Vince on any of this and tell Vince anything about geography. Oklahoma is not part of the South. That's out west. But suddenly, Tracy became Freddie Joe Floyd because Jerry Briscoe's first name is Floyd and Jack's first name was Freddie Joe. And he became from Oklahoma. And he's like, oh, I just, whatever the fuck. He wasn't mad at me, but I was embarrassed for everybody that was involved in that.
It was definitely a difficult time for him, though, because those guys weren't making a lot of money. And they were responsible for all their trans and their hotels. And I know he was surprised by all that. He stayed at my house when he wrestled at Madison Square Garden for the first time. We took the Long Island Railroad into Madison Square Garden. When that must
have been fun with having Tracy on that thing.
That was a lot of fun because he was just, once we got to Queens, anyone from Long Island will understand this. Once we got past Valley Street, he was looking out the window and he just kept asking, are there a lot of gangs here? Is this a big gang area? I mean, no, it's Queens. This is where they killed chickens. But he was already looking for like other options because that was when he was trying to get into an arena football league. He was already thinking about it there in 96. Yeah.
Well, no, as soon as they told him his name was Freddie Joe Floyd, he was starting to think of other options. But anyway, but that's, and then, I didn't watch a lot of the ECW stuff, but I was glad that Paulie used him. But, once again, I wasn't a fan of him, having to pretend to be Italian. I just saw Tracy in more prominent positions than what he was featured at in the rest of his TV run. But after
he made the best of it, though. You got to give him credit. He made the best of it.
He did. Well, he made the best out of everything, as much as he could, and I think that's why he got so much publicity. That's one of the things I said at the start of this. Why other guys who have been, let's face it, bigger stars in the business maybe longer ago, but bigger stars in the business didn't get nearly as much attention when they passed because all the guys loved Tracy. It wasn't, to be honest, it wasn't a groundswell of the fans at first, but it was the boys in the business that found out about it first and spread the news, and then all the news sites and everything picked up on it. But everybody loved Tracy because everybody coming up over the last 20 years at one point or another has worked with him or worked around him or just been around him. And, he's always trying to help everybody as far as advice and do this or don't do that, or not in the way I would, but in a friendly way, because that was just him, but because he wanted guys to get better. And I've seen him go out and work his ass off to try for his opponent to have a good match that he probably had no business having, but he was having it with Tracy. So Tracy made a point of making sure he did, right? One of those type of deals. And then, even the last couple times I've seen him, I've only seen him actually perform maybe a couple times in the last, I don't know how many years. Because I didn't do that many independent shows, but on he worked, God damn it. I think it wasn't Bobby Fulton's the last time I saw Bobby Fulton have a match was for Gary Damron over at All Star Wrestling in West Virginia when we had the Midnight reunion last year, and they put the Midnight in the Hall of Fame over there.
Oh, that's right, with Stephen New's daughters.
Yes, the Legends match on the card. I'm just thinking about this now. He had booked Bobby Fulton versus Tracy Smothers, and this was before Bobby was diagnosed with his cancer, and I assume before Tracy also. But the point is, I said beforehand, I said, Bobby, because Bobby had been having trouble with his eye. He's lost some vision in one eye. And I said, they wanted me to go out and manage or do something. And I said, hey, why don't we just have a little fun rather than anybody taking too many bumps here? And anyway, that's when Tracy came out doing his heel thing and doing the promo, and Bobby Fulton had just done his promo talking about how proud he was to be there and be recognized as a legend. And they had the portraits that Steve New's daughter had painted of him and all this stuff and everything, and the big presentation. And then he said, Bobby said, I've lost the sight in one of my eyes, this one here, and I don't wrestle much anymore, but I'm looking forward to having a good, clean wrestling match with Tracy Smothers. And then Tracy comes out and he's doing the heel promo, and he takes the picture of Bobby Fulton that poor Steve New's daughter is drawn, and he breaks it over his head. No, he said, which of your eyes is the bad one? And Bobby pointed to his right one, this right here, and he thumbed at Bobby in his bad eye. Oh, my God. And then he takes the portrait and he breaks it over Bobby's head. And he fucking shoves me out of the way, and he does what? And he's going to take Bobby's eye out. And I jumped up and shoved him, and Bobby Fulton did a schoolboy, and Steve New rolled in and counted 1, 2, 3, and the people went banana. But anyway, so that may be the last job that Bobby Fulton has ever done, or that Tracy Smothers has ever done. Come to think of it, he was noted for not wanting to do job. No, he would argue sometimes about, do you think we ought to put so and so over? No, Tracy, just hold on. But he was that way. So that's like I've said, all the guys have had a chance to work with him or to be around him, and it was fun, and he was one of those. He was one of those characters. I can use that word here. I hate the word character in wrestling, except when it's used like Mama Cornette used to use it. Not what character does he portray, but boy, that guy's a real character. That's the way you're supposed to use character, and Tracy was a character, and that's why everybody, was so fond of him. So whether it be the independent guys, the guys in WWF, everybody's been around him at one point or another, and everybody had good things to say. And I guess, as a matter of fact, did you find that the information on the GoFundMe?
Yeah, I have the GoFundMe here. It's not really an easy to say address. So what we'll do is I tweeted it out the other day. I'll retweet it again when this show comes out. But what they're doing is it's now billed as Tracy Smothers Memorial Fund. They're trying to get together the money to afford the funeral service. And lots of people from professional wrestling have already donated. Lots of fans have already donated. So what we'll do is you could go to GoFundMe and search for Tracy Smothers Memorial Fund, or I'll make sure I tweet this out when the show comes out.
Okay, and I will retweet that and obviously send something and etc. But I don't know.
Which matches should fans seek out that never saw him at his peak, let's say? Some of the younger fans. I would think, obviously, the match with Dirty White Boy at Bluegrass Brawl.
Well, that's what I was going to say. I looked, and if you go to YouTube, but besides, obviously, we talked about the Midnight and Southern Boys from the 1990 Great American Bash in Baltimore. Also, if you go to YouTube, Tracy Smothers versus Dirty White Boy, SMW, or Smoky Mountain Wrestling, or Chain Match. It's not, I looked at it actually. It's not one of those like 5th generation VHS dubs that you can barely, because there's a lot of ghosts and a lot of, break up a picture. It's not that. It's just dark. It appears to be off the VHS, but the people that did that didn't do a great job of it. But that's a great match.
The story behind it's almost as good as the actual match, because obviously Dirty White Boy decided that he was from New York, started wearing a Yankee jersey. The wild-eyed Southern boy, Tracy Smothers, is Mr. Southern Wrestling. And
now hold on, don't just jump ahead of it. Then if you're gonna give the background, Dirty White Boy was managed by none other than Mr. Ron Wright, who was the all-time East Tennessee wrestling legend. And they decided that because the fans were on the side of the wild-eyed Southern boy, that they were ashamed of the South, and instead they sold their property down there and moved to New York, and were officially introduced from New York, wore New York Yankees ball caps and jerseys, and committed the unpardonable sin of in Jellicoe, Tennessee, by the way, and the high school was not apprised that this was going to take place ahead of time. Even they just thought we were doing some wrestling TV taping. They brought a big metal barrel in the middle of the ring, handcuffed Tracy to the ropes, and burned the Confederate flag in front of him while it was only inches out of his reach to stop it. And that required getting even. And the only way the Dirty White Boy and that evil Ron Wright would allow Tracy to get even and fight for the Smoky Mountain Heavyweight Championship is if he fought Dirty White Boy in Ron Wright's specialty, the Tennessee chain match. Left wrist to left wrist with a 10-foot steel chain, and everybody in that territory had grown up seeing Ron Wright peel the skin off people with that Tennessee chain and give them a good old-fashioned East Tennessee dog whooping. But Tracy Smothers was going to be different. And by gum, he was. Now, when you watch that match, bear in mind this was April 2nd, right, in eastern Kentucky. So it's not hot weather. But at the Hazard Memorial, it was the Memorial Gym at the old college gym there. Not Hazard, let me say that again, Pikeville. The old Pikeville College gym. And there was not only no air conditioning, but also they didn't think they'd need it. But once we got the TV lights in there, and once we oversold the building, it was 125 fucking degrees in that place. The walls were sweating. And they went out there and did a half hour carrying, and that was a real chain. It wasn't one of these goddamn plastic or aluminum deals that they've tried to get away with sometimes in modern times. It was a fucking chain, and they carried that thing for 30 minutes. And in the finish, when you watch that match, it was the old Tennessee chain match finish. And why would you do anything else? The heel wraps the chain around the babyface's neck and cranks him over his shoulder and walks around touching all four corners of the ring. But as he goes by, the babyface that's backwards and has that thing around his neck reaches his left hand out and touches the turnbuckle behind him. The heel ain't paying attention. Referee Mark Curtis is in there 1-1, 2-2. And then they were both bleeding. They were both sweating. It was 125 degrees. And now Tony has cinched up on that chain to the point that Tracy is being choked out. Tony plods by the third buckle and Tracy misses it. Tony takes him back and Tracy can't get it. And he fucking puts the brakes on. And he's like, God damn it. Okay, good. And Tony had to let him loose to punch him in the fucking head. Boom. And wrap him back up again where he could breathe and start the thing again. And this time they get 3-3. And Tracy puts the brakes on. And fucking Tony jerks him, and he goes over the top of Tony, backwards rolling on his ass, boom, and touches the buckle, and the fucking babies flew in the air. Those people went insane. Because it was two guys that had a fucking struggle with a goddamn 25-pound fucking chain for half an hour in that oven, bleeding and sweating, and you got with it. And they got to see what they'd paid to see, which was Tracy Smothers get even. And of course, that's the night that they told the story. The Klan was there and came up and told Tracy.
That was what I was going to say. Tracy was at the gimmick table, and some guy comes up to him and says, "Good luck tonight. If you don't get him, we will," and hands him a business card.
Yeah.
And I don't know what his position was, but it's someone from the Ku Klux Klan. Tracy immediately went in the back and threw up.
Well, he was the comptroller.
I don't know if he was the Grand Wizard or I don't know what
I don't think they actually put the particular, fucking details on this.
They don't put their job titles on their business card.
I'm pretty sure maybe, and not phone number or email also, but
hooded number 1. But no, Tracy
Ron was sitting on his fucking pistol in his wheelchair just in case. But and as Tracy came back, he told us, but I'm like, well, don't worry, you're going over. And we didn't have any trouble. And that's another thing that Tracy mentioned a long time ago. And I will say this again, because especially in modern times, people have actually taken a clip from where Dixie Dynamite, Scott Armstrong did the Dixie Dynamite gimmick before Tracy came in as a wild-eyed Southern boy and had Scott's mask, and it was all the Confederate colors, Dixie Dynamite. Because it was a gimmick that he used to work in Pensacola and Continental with, which was in Dixie. And there was his match on TV against the Stormtrooper in Smoky Mountain Wrestling, who had the fucking Nazi Stormtrooper outfit. And people said, what was the thought behind booking the Stormtrooper? Well, he had the fucking suit. And that's his gimmick that he fucking did jobs in on TV. I needed a job guy. I said, hey, come on and do a job for me. But Tracy made the point that all the people that he never meant any disrespect or any hate or any ill will toward anybody with the Confederate flag. It was his gimmick that he used because he was from the South, and because when you grew up in the South, you saw the flag. You didn't see any backlash or hear any backlash to the flag in those days because it was everywhere. And once again, I'm not saying whether that's right or wrong. Of course, when you come down to it, it was the losing side in a battle of insurrection. However, at that point in time, the Confederate flag was what, when you went to Myrtle Beach, South Carolina on vacation, you bought something with a Confederate flag on it because everything sold there had a Confederate flag on it. What was on your cap, Brian Last, that said American by birth, Southern by the grace of God?
There was an American flag, and next to it was the rebel flag.
Confederate flag, yeah.
Confederate flag, yeah.
And as hard as it may be for some people who now just instantly go, well, how can you not realize that that's a symbol of oppression and the Nazis? The Nazis weren't using it in Knoxville because there wasn't any Nazis. Not at least that we ever saw or could find. The Klan used it, but everybody was used to them, and we didn't really cultivate their patronage or participation. But most people just had it out in front of their house, or just because they got it on vacation. I got a fucking Confederate flag bandana autographed by members of Lynyrd Skynyrd 20-something years ago, because they sold those at their concerts. And the point was, Tracy never meant anything bad by that. It was a symbol to them, like it was a lot of people, of just home. This is what we see when we go home. They're flying around everywhere because people have used it and co-opted it to endorse their shit. But for a lot of people, they didn't think that way. And Tracy's one of those people that didn't ever think that way. So I saw some guys was a couple of years ago on, well, this guy, and then center, well, fuck, because that was his gimmick. And it was never attached in his mind as to anything bad otherwise than something that he flew because that was his gimmick and he was from home. I don't know any other way to phrase it.
Other matches I think that people should, if they can find it, definitely check out. Thugs versus Heavenly Bodies at the Super Bowl of Wrestling.
That was a good one.
That was fantastic. And of course, there was that whole backstory with Tracy and Ricky Morton, so you didn't know what exactly you were going to do. And it ended up being just one of the great matches I ever saw live. It's great on video, but live in the building, it was fantastic. And that's, of course, where Tracy pile drives Tom Pritchard right through the table. You could never redo that the exact same way ever again.
Okay, and here's the thing. Originally the spot, and it's on tape, so you can see it. We had advertised it was the biggest show we'd ever done. The main event was Shawn Michaels and Buddy Landel for the Intercontinental title. The gate, I think, was like $4 or $5 grand bigger than Night of Legends the previous year. And we had advertised the first in the Rock and Roll Express versus Thugs, Tracy and Tony series, 2 babyface teams, what's going to happen. And we've told this story on other podcasts, but Tracy's and Ricky Morton's girls got in a fight and there were blah, blah, blah. So then it became Tracy and Tony, the Thugs, versus the surprise return of the Heavenly Bodies from the WWF. And I wanted to make sure that we gave the people as good a match as possible and some wild shit and start some stuff and etc. because we were substituting one of the 2 main events already on the show. But we did, at least we had the bodies, which, made it a little bit more palatable, a substitution. And we're going to have a big fucking brawl. And I gave them the spot. I said to go, because we had to pay $88 for those tables in Knoxville when we broke them. And they must have bought like 7,000 tables at the Knoxville Civic Coliseum back in 1962 because they were all the same. They were those old particle board tables. They weren't like Formica, like the ones that break in half easily. They had weird metal legs that folded out and they were particle board tops and real rough. And I said, go ahead. I said, and I think it was Tony was going to shoot Dr. Tom off while they were on the floor to Tracy, and Tracy was going to backdrop him, and Tom was going to go through the fucking table, which is how you use a table. It happens to be sitting there, and somebody falls through it rather than you set it up and you put it, blah, blah, blah. Anyway. Well, when Tracy backdropped him, Doc didn't get in the right place, and he had to kind of do a handstand on the table, and he just kind of went over and boom, and it didn't break. And it was kind of like a popcorn fart. And I'm like, shit, as I go by, Tony's chasing me, whatever. I'm like, see if you can break it. And that's all I said. So a second later, I see Tracy getting Doc up for a pile driver. I'm like, holy shit. When he pile drove him, the table broke, but the table didn't break in half. For anybody that's never seen this clip, a hole broke underneath Tracy's ass, and they just went straight through the table was still sitting up, perfectly upright, and they just went straight through it and for this round hole that Tracy's ass and Tom's head made, and got stuck. Tom upside down and Tracy folded up like a jackknife with his legs sticking out of one side and his fucking head sticking out of the other side. So, and then the people liked that one, Brian. So that was the origination of that table breaking.
The other match I think of, or maybe series of matches would be a better way to say it, is Tracy and Chris Candido.
Yeah.
And of course they had those ladder matches, which, correct me if I'm wrong, I think the ladder matches they had were before the WrestleMania one. Was it before the WrestleMania 10 ladder match with Shawn and Razor? I mean, it was around the same time.
Some of them were concurrent. Because, see, I'd seen Michaels and Razor do it on a house show out in California before WrestleMania. And I got the idea. I said, well, Tracy and Candido are the only 2 that can do this. So I asked them, and because they knew the concept, because they'd done them, and they hadn't done them, but the ladder matches had been done in Calgary. So they all, and I'm sure Candido had tapes to study. so they started doing them. It was because some were before and some were afterwards. And I think they did one on TV, and goddamn it, that's when we needed new ring posts. Because what we did, because we couldn't fly anything from these high school gym roofs, we'd had to rent a scissor lift and everything. So we'd put a pole up opposite ring posts. We'd tape a pole to them, and we would put the rope across the pole and hang the check from that. Well, we needed new ring posts on our ring, and as the more they took bumps and the ring posts were kind of bent anyway, the poles started slipping in, and then the fucking the rope wasn't tight. It's hanging the check. So it got to the point where they could get up on like the third step of the ladder and get it if they were unmolested. But they, once again, they did a great job with those, and they were so athletic, and again, Candido was strong as a bull, so they could make some. And we were just getting those fucking ladders at Home Depot. Also, it wasn't like these custom made jobs that they have in the WWF where you can climb from every side. And at one point, the metal leg broke on one of the ladders from being in the ring where the mat was squishy and everything, and poor Hildebrand had to get under it and become a human leg, which he almost had a third leg. Maybe it was just the fact that he was a smaller individual anyway, but Hildebrand could have been the next John Holmes, but he made a third leg under the fucking ladder and held it up so that Tracy and Candido, here's he's 5'6" and 145 pounds. He's holding up the ladder so that 450 pounds of wrestler can climb it. So anything of Tracy and Smoky Mountain that's on YouTube, I don't know what the Evil Empire may have yanked down. Obviously, there's a lot of stuff from ECW, and I don't know of any of those to recommend offhand. And there's probably, more of their, I didn't see a lot of their WCW stuff after we left, but he and Steve, were there for a while, even as the Young Pistols. Tracy was still doing the best he could do under the bad gimmick circumstances. But anyway, yes, and we will retweet the GoFundMe information and everything, but I don't know what else to say, and you've got me through this. I appreciate it, Brian, but I don't know what to say that anybody else hadn't already said. Here was a guy that really, as we said, he wasn't one of those guys that made big money and then blew it. And didn't, he worked hard at everything he did, and just, he should have gotten some better breaks to be more successful financially in this industry than what he was. And so anything that you can donate is not going to reward or somebody that was just irresponsible and whatever, and expecting somebody else to take up for him. It's somebody that really deserves it and did deserve it. And, I don't know what else to say.
As a wrestler, he was a great wrestler. And as a person, he was a great person. Like you said, universally loved. You don't hear anyone say, that goddamn Tracy Smothers. No, everyone loved him. And it was a multi-generational thing. The guys who came up with him, the guys that worked with him in the 80s or 90s, they loved him. And the next generation of wrestlers, the younger crop of guys that sat in a locker room with him. I saw CM Punk tweeted out a bunch of stuff about how helpful Tracy was to him early in his career. There's a lot of guys that have that story. So he's someone who people who worked with him during the prime of his career loved him, and then the next generation of guys who got to learn from him loved him.
And yeah, he'd had his, as he used to say, I've had my bell rung. He's had his bell rung umpteen times, so he would sometimes just flip off and get pissed at something or somebody or whatever. And everybody seen him do the shadow boxing, not even shadow boxing, just punching lockers, because he'd work himself up about something, but then he'd be just as quick to apologize later on or whatever. Oh man, I don't know. And there's another clip on YouTube. I'll say this. We'll end on a high note. There's another clip on YouTube. One of the VHS tapes that we released in Smoky Mountain was the A Country Boy Can Survive, the best of Tracy Smothers. It had some of his matches on there. And also, I kept and put together some of the bloopers and the promo outtakes, because Tracy would get so wound up. And I mean, one of them, he's doing his promo, and the black sheet that we taped up as a background, taped up to the wall, came down behind him, fell halfway down, but he never even stopped. And everybody's giggling, and he don't know why they're giggling, but he don't want to stop. And another time it's like, and Brian Lee, let me tell you something, you no good, self-centered prick. And he goes, oops, because you can't say that back then. You can now. But the best one was, this was when he and Tony were the Thugs. So they had just done something in WCW. I can't remember what, but something on their TV that pissed him off, because he had a bad experience, as we mentioned, in WCW anyway. And so it didn't take much, and they had done something, and he's doing a promo about Tony and him against the Heavenly Bodies, or I think it was going to be. But instead he says, and you got WCW, or he didn't even say WCW. He said, you got people that have no respect for this business or the people in it. You got big fat Vader. And he started, what the fuck, and down there, and this guy and that no good Eric Bischoff. And they don't have any respect for wrestling and blah. And he got started on his promo, and he said, if you got any problem with what I have to say, I live it. 827 Hillside Drive in Springfield, Tennessee. It was his home address. and I'm dying laughing. I think we ended up airing it because he eventually got back around to who he was wrestling, but it made sense in the context of what he was talking about. But at the same time, he just got mad on the promo, working himself up, and cut a promo on fucking WCW and gave him his home address in case they needed to come see him. So, and that is out on YouTube also. Tracy Smothers bloopers or something, I think. Anyway, I as I said 45 minutes ago, I don't know what else to say. I'll miss Tracy. Nobody worked harder for me when I was running my company. I was a fan of his to watch him wrestle and as a personality, and we had a lot of fun just bullshitting. And that's another thing. I don't know why all this shit happens to people. Tracy had beaten his body up, yes, but do bumps give you cancer? He didn't use tobacco. He didn't do the things one would normally. He didn't use steroids. If he did, they didn't work. So I don't know, what else you're supposed to not do to not get all these horrible illnesses.